really quite qualified to present to us this morning. She holds her Bachelor's of Science degree in Major Medical Technology from Madonna University in Livonia, Michigan. Her master's degree in Medical Microbiology and Immunology with a minor in Pathology from Wayne State University, where she also earned her PhD. Cynthia served on the faculty at UWM from 1974 to 2002. She married her husband, Warren Sommer, in 1972. They have been married 48 years. Please welcome Cynthia Sommer.
Everybody here? Sounds good? She forgot to mention I make good popcorn in the Emporium.
Yes.
Okay, the title of the talk is Understanding COVID-19, and I realize now that I gave you the title, that's a rather presumptive title. We're going to be learning about COVID for the next number of years, so I know a lot of you are just reading all the stuff in the newspapers and in TV, and that covers a lot of the statistics and what's happening with the vaccine. So I'm going to take a little different perspective. So what I hope to cover is to give you a little bit of the biological aspects of what's happening in this infection. We're going to talk about the virus, and the virus is the enemy. So we want to know just a little bit what properties does the virus have that makes them capable of producing disease, and we also want to know how we handle things. What's our response? And if I can get the clicker to work.
Oh, is it on, Cynthia, on the side of the...
I think I got it on.
What's going on?
I'm not sure. Maybe the battery.
Oh, there. Is this one, the red one is the...
Yeah, but the pointer, I was trying to do the pointer.
Oh, you were trying to do the pointer. There we go. Yeah.
Does it work? Oh yeah, here it is.
It's so tiny.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. And so we want to know what we have that can counteract the virus. And we have a lot that makes us capable of counteracting the virus. The main thing is to vaccinate ourselves and in turn stimulate our immune response. What we're trying to do to combat that virus is to create herd immunity. And we'll define that, make sure we're all on the same page as far as our understanding. And the last thing, we'll talk about the many vaccines. We're scheduled to get vaccines on the 14th on Valentine's Day. So it helps to have an understanding what you're going to be injected with. Well, the virus that causes this infection is called coronavirus. And the reason that it got the name coronavirus is when the scientists looked at it under very high power electron microscopy, it looked like it had a corona, like the sun's corona, surrounding it. And it's partly due to the molecules that are on the outside. And if you look at the virus, that's these little blue things. Viruses aren't blue, they just colored them so we can see them. They give you sort of like a halo around the virus. And so that's how it got its name. And viruses are very small. It's sometimes hard, we measure it in nanometers. But one way to sort of get a perspective, if I were one cell in your body, the virus would be about half the size of this clicker. So they're very small. So it's not unusual that you can have hundreds and hundreds of these virus particles in a cell that's infected. So they're small creatures. Well, we've got to be also on the same page as far as the nomenclature and how they're describing the virus. So when we use the name coronavirus, we're actually talking about a large group of viruses that have certain characteristics that look like the picture that we last saw. So COVID-19 is just one of hundreds of coronaviruses. And there's about 4 or 5 coronaviruses that cause a common cold that you probably had during your lifetime. So be aware, it's a general term, it's not incorrect, but it's a little bit more specific to call it COVID-19. So the World Health Organization labeled it COVID-19, and the name comes from the fact that it's a coronavirus, produces disease, and it was first identified in 2019. Well, in the scientific literature, and to be a little bit more correct, another group of scientists, an international group, labeled it SARS-CoV-2. And the SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. So, severe because it can kill you. Acute because the symptoms usually come within 5 to 10 days after exposure. And this is in contrast to something like AIDS, HIV, or hepatitis viruses, where it takes years or a number of months to see the disease. It's called, it affects the respiratory system, which everybody knows about, but it's also what we term a syndrome. It has lots of signs and symptoms. It's called coronavirus 2 because there was, in 2002 and 2003, a similar cousin of this virus that appeared in China again. They killed 700, 800 people, but it was an epidemic. They controlled it and never got to be a pandemic. So since this is the second one that has appeared, they label it coronavirus 2. So you'll see this in the newspapers, but more common in the scientific literature. So this is what the virus looks like. And one of the things you gotta think about when you think about viruses is they're parasites. They cannot survive unless they infect us, get into a cell. So first they have to attach to the cell, they have to get internalized into the cell, and they basically take over the cell, use our machinery, our amino acids, to make its molecules. So this is just a picture of the virus and finding the unique molecules on our cells that it likes to attach to. So this just depicts these spike proteins that will attach to a molecule on our cells. The molecule is just a molecule that's important for blood pressure, inflammation. It's called ACE2. It's not important for you to remember, but each virus tends to like a certain type of molecule it binds to. Once it binds to it, our cells just take it in and then starts the infection process. This is a more detailed diagram of the virus, and there's two molecules that are important for us to know in regards to vaccine, lab tests, and everything else. And they are the spike protein that sticks on the outside of the cell, and the genes that are on the inside of, it's not a cell, it's a membrane enclosed structure that has messenger RNA as far as its genetic material. The reason these are important is, first of all, when we had our lab tests this week, they were trying to detect the presence of the virus. Well, what they were looking for, the PCR test that takes a day to get the results, is they're looking for this molecule. Again, viruses are small. What they do is they take the swab, get the virus out, and they amplify, make millions of copies of this such that they have enough in the test tube that we can actually see the presence of the virus. And they match it up to what we know is the SARS-2 virus or the COVID virus. The other test that we had about a month or so ago was the antigen test, the one that took only a half an hour to get results on. And what they were doing was detecting this protein. The other reason that these molecules are important is when we make vaccines, what we're doing is we're trying to make an immune response to these spike proteins. To do that, sometimes we're going to use part of the genetic material, and sometimes we're going to isolate these molecules and inject it into us. So there's various types of vaccines which we'll get into. So if the virus did not have these molecules, they would not be capable of infecting us. So the genes are really the blueprint to make new virus. And this is for the virus to get inside the cell. And the virus can infect a number of tissues, which you may be aware of. Most certainly, everybody knows the respiratory system, but it can also infect the heart, the kidneys, the brain, and the blood vessels, and a variety of other organ systems. And it can sometimes cause havoc in these systems. So the typical symptoms that you may see, some of the early signs and symptoms is sometimes people say they have a loss of smell, that you're inhaling the virus, it's multiplying in your nose, so that's one of the symptoms that you see. We also know fever. Anytime anybody comes into the building of the staff, they're measured for their temperature. But the classic symptoms are, things that are associated with the respiratory cough. Usually it's a dry cough, not too much sneezing and whatnot. But the kidneys, you can have diarrhea, you can have an impact on the circulatory system. Actually, the heart and the kidneys have a higher concentration of those ACE2 molecules, and therefore have a greater chance of, once it gets into the system, of being infected. So it just basically takes over the body. Well, unfortunately, we're in the wrong age group here. Age is a risk factor. And we know that actually the majority of cases, over 80% of the cases, are not going to end up in the hospital. Especially if you're a young child, in the teens, you're probably just going to have asymptomatic symptoms. But most certainly they can be infected, and you're going to have fever, tired, cough. If they did a CT scan on the lung, you'd see kind of opaque spots in the lung tissue, and you can get pneumonia. We're most certainly concerned about it getting worse, but one of the things that we're learning these days is that some of the people, even the asymptomatic and the mild disease, can have signs and symptoms about 2, 3, 4 months after the initial infection. They call them long haulers or post-COVID syndrome. So we're still worried about those. We're learning about those all the time because they're going to be people we're going to have to take care of in the future. What we're concerned about is keeping people out of the hospital and the amount of care that's needed. So as you get older, your chance of getting COVID serious cases increases. So a number of people will have dyspnea, is just a difficulty in breathing. We know that there's a number of comorbidities, other illnesses that make you susceptible, diabetes, obesity, if you have any respiratory problems, COPD, if you have heart problems, everything from people with Down syndrome and a variety of other things. So that increases the probability that you might end up, whoops, didn't want to do that. Good. Now we're reading. So you don't, you want to make sure if you have those conditions, take care of yourself, make sure you wear your mask, and hopefully as soon as the vaccine comes about, to take it. So these are the people that need intensive care, ICU, and what we're concerned about, whether some of these will progress to have much more serious conditions. That just stands for acute respiratory disease. And if you watch the TV, they're flipping the patient to decrease the pressure on the lungs. They're doing CPR because people are having major impact on the heart, and it can affect the kidneys. They may mention, we ran out of dialysis machines in some of the smaller hospitals. So we're trying to understand, and can we help the people with these serious conditions? And there's a condition called cytochrome storm, and we know that 20 to 30% of the people in this critical condition have this body's response. So what is cytochrome storm? First you have to know what cytochromes are. Cytokines, not cytochromes, cytokines, are nothing more than communication molecules from one white blood cell to another white blood cell, or possibly to blood vessels and some of the ancillary cells. And there's a lot of them, and they give them various designation. I always call it the alphabet soup of the immune system. So what happens is these are made either in excess, some of them are made less than should be made, and the result is you have excessive inflammation. The consequence of this is that you can have a lot of fluid coming into the lungs, can't breathe very well if the lungs are responding to an infection, can have kidney failure, can have heart attack. So a typical scenario is we got the virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We got the SARS virus binding to its receptor, the ACE2 receptor, and it's going to just multiply and divide. And if we have really a lot of rapid virus multiplication, the immune system can't turn on fast enough. And in turn, some of the turn on is inappropriate. Usually the immune system makes these molecules and makes them in a certain order. So what happens is the immune cells see the virus and say, I gotta do something. They're gonna send out these molecules. These molecules bring cells to the area of the virus infection, and they can't handle it. So what do? They send out more molecules, and more cells come, and sometimes they still can't handle the situation, and they send out more molecules. So I always think of it as 1 alarm, 3 alarm, 5 alarm fire. We've got such a massive response. The consequence is that you end up with excessive hyperinflammation. And this hyperinflammation, rather than being good, it causes damage of the tissue. And most certainly, if anybody has any questions along the way, please ask, okay? So we're understanding this. They're treating it with drugs, dexamethasone, to try and tamper down the immune response. But it's still, people do die. They haven't figured out the best way to treat things. Well, in any infection, it's a balancing act between us and the microbes. In this case, the virus has certain properties that allow it to bind very tightly to the cells and to multiply very rapidly. But you know, if you even think of bacterial infections, if you have a bacterial infection, what you do is you treat them with antibiotics, and that changes the balance between the microbe and us. So it gives us a better chance to turn on our immune system, control the number of bacteria that are in the system. But with viruses, they're so small and they have so few molecules that it's very difficult to find antibiotic-like substances to control the virus. And they're doing, right now I think I read, there's something like 400 different studies that are going on to see if we can find drugs that would control the multiplication of the virus, but they haven't found any that's really good. So what's our options? We can try and stimulate the host response. And that's what we do with vaccines, is we're trying to counteract the balance between us and the microbe. Well, when we try and define the virus, we look at how deadly is it? What's the case fatality rate, or what's the death, what's the probability if somebody gets infected that they're gonna die? We're getting better at controlling that in the sense of got better treatment. Most certainly than at the start of the disease, but it is age-related, and so it's probably more like 1 to 2% here in developed countries, but in Brazil, South Africa, other countries, the fatality rate is much higher. The other thing we look at is how transmittable is it? How infectious is it? And it's a reasonably infectious organism. And what they're saying is if one person is infected, how many more people will be infected from that person? So they say 2.5 to 3 people for every person that has the infection. What's making the news these days is these variants that are out there. There's one from United Kingdom, one from South Africa, one from Brazil, and they're a little bit more infectious. And why are they a little bit more infectious? Some of these viruses, everybody remembers these toys. The spikes here, the tighter they bind, the greater probability they're going to get into the cell. So some of these viruses, one, can bind more tightly, these variants, and the other thing is they multiply and divide and make more copies of themselves inside the cell. So just a numbers game. There's more viruses in the system.
What is that you're holding? I don't hear that I saw.
Oh, you throw it against the wall and so this is just a toy, is what it is.
So you throw it against the wall and what?
And it'll stick. So it's just a fun thing to show the spikes. Well, when we compare this virus to some of the other viruses, even something as simple as a common cold, you're not going to die of the common cold. You might get pneumonia in a very, very small percentage of people. But it's reasonably infectious. You probably know that, if somebody in your house got the cold, it's not unusual that somebody else is going to get it. Kids bring it in, parents get it, vice versa. Things like measles, again, measles is not going to cause death. But it's reasonably infectious. And so, everybody's worried about the fact that the kids are not getting vaccinated these days. We're going to have some outbreaks of measles. We would want to go out there and vaccinate them very quickly. So, and compared to the 1918 influenza, it's about the same as far as the deaths, a little less infectious. And it took 2-3 years for us to have infections of influenza before it got under control. So when they figure out what percentage of people do we have to get immune to have herd immunity, they're looking at these numbers. This is called a R0. That's not important to know. But the more infectious something is, that means it'll spread faster, increased probability that we're going to have infection and disease. Well, we're not defenseless. We've got a lot of things in our body that can counteract any infectious agent. And we have two major systems. And sometimes it's hard to understand why we have so many cells out there. But when you even think about this virus, sometimes the virus is floating through the bloodstream and the tissue fluids, and sometimes the virus is inside of cells multiplying and dividing. So we most certainly have different approaches for it. All of these cells are your white blood cells. There. All of these cells are your white blood cells, and most of them will be floating through the bloodstream to constantly look for some infectious agent. Some cells are more apt to stay in the tissues, and they're going to be one of our first line of defense. And their job is to engulf, digest, try and keep the infectious agent under control. So these two systems that we have, and the reason that we have it is so that we don't waste a lot of energy and spin our wheels depending on how infectious something is. So we have our innate immunity, which will produce a response right away. As soon as something enters our body, these cells will engulf and digest the infectious agent. And if they don't handle it very well, they're going to send signals into the bloodstream to attract additional cells. And hopefully together, they will produce a predictive response. And that's the typical thing that you think of, you know, when you have an inflammatory response. If you cut your finger, it gets red, it's tender, it swells. Well, that's the response of these particular cells. Well, what if they can't handle it? These are cells that all they have to decide on is, this is foreign, it's not like me, I need to do something. But if they can't multiply and respond in great numbers. So our backup system is what is termed our adaptive immune system. And these are various types of lymphocytes, other types of white blood cells that will respond, but it takes them a while to get turned on, takes them a while to multiply and divide, and to produce a response. And they come under different names. We don't call them lymphocytes these days, we call them T cells and B cells, or natural killer cells. It's easier to describe them. So we got lots of things that we can use to produce a response. So in a typical infection, the virus comes in or the bacteria comes in, and those macrophages, those early response cells, are going to digest the information, and they're going to present the information to our backup system. They need to send a memo, we got a serious condition. They're going to present it to some cells that are lymphocytes, T cells, and the T cell is the boss in the show. He directs what's going to happen. He's going to tell the B cells to turn on and make a protein molecule that we call antibodies. These antibodies are going to bind to the virus and block its ability to infect cells. And so you may hear on TV they talk about neutralizing antibodies. It's just the antibodies that can stop the infection. And they can also bind to some cells to help clean up the mess, get rid of the infection. Other cells, they don't show them here, T cytotoxic cells are very good at handling things that are inside of cells. And they get turned on, multiply and divide, produce a response, they kill the infected cell and stop the infection. So if we control things, we're healthy and we overcome the infectious process. So here's a scenario which shows the T cell. It sees the information about the virus, and it has to be very exact in how it looks at it, and it's going to get turned on. It's activated. The next thing it does is multiply and divide. And this takes a lot of energy for the body to do that. Why are you fatigued? Remember that the body's got to do lots of things. The heart's got to beat, the kidneys got to filter, the lungs have to breathe. So the way the body has done things is, if we need a special situation where certain cells need to be made, we're going to divert that energy to allow the immune system to function. So it's going to multiply and divide, and it's going to turn on and turn on molecules such that it can do its job. And there's going to be three important cells that are going to be made. B cells that are going to make these antibody proteins. T killer cells that can kill cells that are infected by the virus. And it's going to make memory cells. And that's going to be the whole basis for why most of the time we don't even know we have an immune response to infectious agents. So this is the cytotoxic T cell. It sees the virus infected cell, or it could be a cancer cell. it's gonna come in contact with, gonna make molecules that make holes in the cell, and the cell dies. And this cell can go and kill another cell. So one of the things about it is that it's much more efficient in response. The cells of the innate system do a one-time job and then they get tired out. These can kill multiple cells. And they're smart enough, they can kill infected cells, but know not to kill any normal cells that might be next to it. So this is how we would handle a cell that's infected by the virus. The second approach we have is for handling the virus while it's going through the body fluids. And it's the B cell that does that, and the B cell is making these protein molecules called antibodies. They always draw them like Y-shaped molecules. And what they're going to do is bind to those spike proteins, because if we can keep those spike proteins from attaching to some cells, we're going to keep it from infecting those cells. And this part of the molecule might join with some cells that will be involved in cleanup of that whole complex. Well, the third type of cell that's important are these memory cells. And we know that if we're exposed to an infectious agent, or if we're going to be thinking about the vaccine that we're going to get, if you have one exposure to the vaccine, one injection, your immune system's going to turn on. It's going to look at that stuff as something foreign. I need to do something to it. And in about a week or so, you're going to have the cells multiplying and dividing at this point, and finally producing a response. And once it cleans up the stuff that has been injected, it's going to turn off to save energy. During this time period, you're going to have memory cells being made, and they're going to be floating through the bloodstream. Well, when we get our second injection of the vaccine, what we will find is we're going to turn on a response a lot faster. In a day or so, we're going to produce a much better response, and we can clear off a larger number of virus particles. So the whole principle of vaccination is that we want to generate memory cells, and after 2 injections, make better memory cells so that we have a lot floating around in the system that can handle the infectious agent. So what we're trying to determine, or what we're trying to do with vaccination, is to create herd immunity. So what's herd immunity? Well, if we have susceptible individuals, the little blue guys, and some infectious person comes in, they can readily transmit the virus to anybody that is susceptible. And shortly, you would have potentially all these people becoming infected. So there's no herd immunity. People have not been exposed to the virus before, they haven't gotten a vaccine, they have no level of protection against this new dangerous infectious agent. Well, what if we get people vaccinated? And here, the green little bodies are people who are vaccinated. So if an infectious person comes in, they might find one susceptible individual, infect them, but these individuals will not get infected because they have protection. And they will protect other people in the population that may not have gotten the vaccine. They will become protected because of the greater number of people in the population that have some immunity. So that's a good thing. So they're changing the numbers, and I don't know if you caught that. They said originally 70% of the population that we're going to have immune. They're increasing the number because of the variants that are out there. So it's more like 75 to 80% they're thinking that we will need. And I have just a short YouTube that hopefully we'll show this.
Vaccines protect us in two ways. Firstly, they protect the individual against serious infectious diseases. In the case of measles, for example, over 99% of people who get 2 doses of the MMR vaccine will be completely protected against catching measles. There is a second way in which vaccines protect us. If the vaccine stops you catching the disease, you can't pass it on to anyone else. This means that when enough people in the population are protected by vaccination, it effectively stops diseases from circulating at all. This is often called herd immunity, but a better name is herd protection, because it helps to protect those who are especially vulnerable to infectious diseases. This includes all newborn babies, because they are too young to be vaccinated, older people, because our immune systems become less effective as we age, people with cancer or an organ transplant, because they are on treatments that seriously weaken the immune system, and people who get vaccinated but just don't make a response to the vaccine for reasons we don't yet fully understand. You will certainly know people in some of these groups. You may have them in your family now or in the future. Perhaps you are in one of these groups yourself. If everyone around these vulnerable individuals is fully vaccinated, it will help protect them against serious diseases like measles that could kill them. So even if you don't feel at risk from the disease yourself, getting vaccinated benefits others in your community and your family. Sometimes herd immunity is used as a reason not to vaccinate. It sounds reasonable. If everyone around you is vaccinated and you are protected by herd immunity, surely it can't make any difference if you don't get vaccinated yourself. The problem is that if enough people behave like this, vaccination rates will soon fall, and then diseases will start to circulate again. This is particularly true for very infectious diseases such as measles. It's also important to realise that herd immunity doesn't guarantee protection. People who don't get vaccinated tend to cluster together in communities. So if a disease outbreak does occur, it's much more likely to spread within these communities than in the population as a whole. And herd immunity doesn't work at all for some diseases like tetanus, which is caught from bacteria in the environment rather than other people. So getting vaccinated gives us the best chance of individual protection, as well as helping to protect some of the most vulnerable people in our society.
Okay, any questions so far? I've been going through a lot of things.
Yeah, it's, you get the vaccination, and have they ever found that anybody that has got the vaccination got the virus right afterwards or anything?
They shouldn't, and they're looking at this, that is to say, they're asking the questions, are these vaccines good and whatnot? And in all these cases that have been looked at so far, there's not a very high number of people who've been vaccinated will get the virus. They just finished a study recently. One of the questions that people are asking, if you get vaccinated, can you still be carrying the virus around in your nose and infecting somebody else? A recent study, and you realize most of these studies have been going on for 6 or 8 months, and so they're kind of evaluating things. But the study in New England Journal of Medicine suggests that people are not walking around with the virus after vaccination. So the hope is that we're not, going to get the virus again, and
then when you get the follow-up vaccination, is that just similar to the first one, just reinforces it, or is it different?
The vaccine, the first shot and the second shot are going to be the same.
What if they find that they still have something there that it's good to have another vaccination?
Right, And that's the question with these variants that are coming around, because they're different. They know from the ones that have occurred in South Africa and in Brazil, some of the vaccines are only 50% effective. And so the companies are working like mad. And one of the things about the types of vaccines that are being made, they can tweak them a little bit to make them capable of protecting against new variants. It's going to take time to do. So it might not, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. They're looking at it very carefully. We might need boosters to the new variants. But most people believe that if you get the vaccine, you're going to have at least protection enough, you're not going to end up in the hospital.
So the newer vaccines that might come out later would have something in there that would take care of the variants.
That's correct. They'll change the virus a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, I need some help. I had ear surgery on.
How long after I receive a vaccination?
How long did what?
After I receive a vaccination, how long is it before that vaccination becomes effective?
Okay, he asked the question of how long does it take for us to be protected? Most people would say after you get the first vaccine, you probably have 50 to 60% efficacy, or your ability to respond to things. Second vaccine gets up to 95%. And like the typical immune response, it takes a couple of weeks to get your level of protection up there. And you can sort of know that from, say for instance, when you get a cold. You get a cold, you're sick for a couple of weeks, and you get over it in 2 to 3 weeks. That means that your immune response has been turned on, taking care of the virus, and you feel well again. So for any type of exposure or vaccine, it'll take a couple of weeks to turn on. And I know you're all anxiously waiting for the vaccine. Yeah.
These new guys, they have a new virus vaccine coming out that you only get one shot. Now, is that just putting like double the amount that you get in the one shot that you're getting now? What is it that makes it so you only get one shot?
He's asking the question as to how can, and we'll get into that in a moment, how can the Johnson & Johnson vaccine only use one shot? It doesn't produce quite as good immunity as 2 shots, but it's still, what we're in is in a crisis situation. We want to keep people out of the hospital. Hospitals are being overrun. So if you get one shot, it definitely protects you from going into the hospital at a probably 80% probability, but you might get a mild infection. Johnson & Johnson is right now doing studies to see the impact of 2 injections of Johnson & Johnson. So everybody's trying to get these things on the market and, make money. Anything else? So what are the types of vaccines that we have? And there's different approaches that are being used. The ones we're going to get are those that use the genetic material of the virus, the messenger RNA, but they're not putting into the vaccine all the genes of the virus. They're just putting in the genes that make the spike protein. And they're putting it into a lipid coat to protect the genes. That RNA, if you would release that RNA into the environment, it gets degraded very quickly. And I always remember the M&M advertisement, let it melt in your mouth, not in your hands. That's the approach they're trying to do. They're trying to protect the genetic material so it gets into your body and can produce an immune response. These are the vaccines that are working very well. They're better than they thought, get 90 to 95% effective as far as producing an immune response. And the other reason that they're so popular right now is it's easy to produce, and if the variants come around, they can change it very quickly. So that's why we think they're going to be good vaccines, but they haven't been used before, so that's part of the concern. So we're getting the Moderna vaccine. These two vaccines are very similar. The main difference between them is the lipid coat in the Moderna vaccine is a lot more stable. The company's got proprietary rights on the recipe for the lipid coat. Therefore, it only has to be stored in the refrigerator. The Pfizer vaccine is the one that they had put it in ultra cold, dry ice conditions. And it presents a problem getting it, especially in rural areas, how you're going to get it if they don't have the refrigeration. So there's a difference in the days between first injection, second injection. That's really not critical as far as the immune response is concerned. So both of them are looked at as good vaccines. So we're scheduled on Valentine's Day, February 14th, to get the first injection, and I think it's March 14th to get our second injection. So those are the two vaccines that have been evaluated. They're available, and it's a question whether these companies can produce a big enough supply to keep everybody happy. The other virus vaccines that are in the news the last couple of days are the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and it's a little bit different, but again, the concept is the same. You're going to use the genetic material of the virus, not just for the spike protein, but you're going to use a virus, another virus, to be a carrier of those genes. This is not an infectious virus. They take out the genes for that virus and multiply and divide. All you're doing is using it to carry that genetic material into our body. And they're using a virus that causes the common cold. So it's not going to multiply and divide and give you a common cold, but it's just going to be used as a carrier for this genetic material. So the virus gets in, turns on the immune response, produces memory, and the reason people are focusing towards this vaccine and the other company, AstraZeneca, is that it can be made more cheaply, and if we're going to try and vaccinate the rest of the world, we've got to find vaccines that are cheaper to make and can be taken out into the rural areas or to the wild west of, say, Africa or South America. And they have had some experience with these vaccines, so they feel, we know what we're doing. Another vaccine that you'll probably hear about in the next, maybe in the next 2-3 weeks, is a vaccine called Novavax. And this is considered a recombinant subunit vaccine, where rather than putting the genes to make the protein and get into your body and ask you to make the spike protein, they're making it in the tissue culture in a lab situation. They isolate that spike protein, and that's what's injected into you. Because it's just protein, and whatever you get in the injection is all you're ever going to get, they have to stimulate the immune response just a little bit to make it work. And so they add substances called adjuvants. Wrong buttons. So they use substances called adjuvants, which are just immune enhancers. This vaccine has not been approved. Again, it's 2 injections, 28 days apart. Again, there's some concern about whether it's going to work against all the strains. The African strain has less of a response. but it's getting up there. If they feel like if we can get 60-70% efficacies, we got a good vaccine. So they're doing some additional trials, and all of these vaccines are the ones that have been paid for by the warp speed contracts by the government. So all of this work is being supported. So the one that's coming on the market is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. One injection, and hopefully by the beginning of March, it will be good. So so far, what it seems like is that it's 72%, which is really very good, effective against infection, and to keep people out of the hospital, it's 85 to 90%. So it's still a very good vaccine. It's a lot cheaper. It's safe, or felt to be safe. Another vaccine, my arthritis is showing here. The other vaccine that may take a lot longer to get on the U.S. market is actually being used in England and a number of other countries. It uses the same approach of the virus, another virus being a carrier. And they had some problems with the virus, with the vaccine, in that one of the study sites, rather than injecting 2 full doses, injected a half dose and then a full dose, and actually they ended up with a better immune response, but because the study was messed up, they got to catch up and show that it is a safe and that the results are meaningful. So it may take a little bit longer for this vaccine to get into the U.S. market. It's a lot cheaper, still produces good immunity, so people are looking for that vaccine to be protected. So when you ask the question, should I get it or shouldn't I get it, you want to think about what are the risk benefits and the personal decision and whatnot, but it does protect you against serious infection and serious disease and death, and we don't want that. And if we get enough people vaccinated, we'll create herd immunity, and this is going to protect people who, have pre-existing conditions. And the other thing why they're rushing to get the vaccine out there is we don't want new mutants occurring. And the mutants are created when the virus can multiply. The virus multiplies when there's susceptible people who can get the infection. And as the virus multiplies, it sometimes makes mistakes, and we end up with mutants. So the less people infected, the less virus multiplication, and hopefully less mutants. And we don't know a lot about these people who still have signs and symptoms months after the infection, these long haulers or post-COVID-19 syndrome, and how much is our healthcare system going to have to take care of these people? That's a big issue. So what are the risks? Well, there's side effects. Well, certainly just from the vaccine, you might have some sore arms, maybe achiness, etc. Happens more often after the second injection, and younger people have more of a reaction because they're turning on a very good immune response. You could have allergic reactions. I'm sure they're going to probably have epinephrine in case somebody has an allergic reaction, severe allergic reaction. But it's very rare. It's like about 2 per million doses injected that there is a serious reaction. So it's very rare. And the main issue is it's a vaccine that we've never had on the market before. So there's a question of, is there some negative effects that we haven't seen yet? But we're about 8 months into, studying the virus, seeing what it does. And I always look at the numbers. So far, 33 million people in the U.S. have received at least 1 dose, and 5 million have received at least 2 doses. So we haven't seen a lot of problems in these individuals. So they would say the vaccine is safe, produces immunity at least 6 to 8 months, maybe longer. And it's an ongoing experiment that's basically going on. Well, just to end with and I think my battery might be dead. What I have at the end is just a review of, I think the battery is dead. We'll stop at this point. I just had some slides on to remind us to wash our hands and the social distance and to make sure that we wear our masks and wear them properly. So we'll stop here, and if anybody has any additional questions, please ask. Is everybody willing to consider getting the vaccine? I hope everybody